Corn cobs in a New Mexico cave revealed a 4000-year farming hack. The Pueblo peoples had engineered 3 plants into one perfect system. Modern agriculture still hasn't matched what indigenous nations solved millennia ago. 3 unrelated plant species, corn, beans, squash, were growing together in perfect biological lock. The question no one has fully answered: how did anyone know to put them there in the first place? This is a cold case, and the evidence is 4,000 years old. The suspects are 3 plants: Zea mays, Phaseolus vulgaris, cucurbita, pepo, corn, beans, squash. Detailed sources documenting all claims appear in the description below. But the history classes never asked the right question. They told you what the system looked like. They never asked why it worked at a biological level. And they never asked who figured it out and how long it took. We are going to ask both. In 1948, an archaeologist named Herbert Dick crawled into a dry cave in Catron County, New Mexico. The cave was called Bat Cave, not a dramatic name, an accurate one. Dick was looking for stone tools, fire rings, the standard vocabulary of prehistoric sites. What he pulled from the compacted earth, instead, stopped him cold. A handful of small, desiccated corn cobs blackened at the tips, no larger than a human finger. Hold up your index finger. That is what 4,000 years of agricultural knowledge looks like in physical form. Dick sent samples to be dated. The results placed those corn cobs at approximately 4,000 years before the present. That is older than the Parthenon in Athens, older than Alexander the Great, older than the Roman Republic. No European presence was possible on this continent for another 3,500 years after those cobs were deposited. The Three Sisters system was not borrowed from anyone outside this hemisphere. It was developed here by indigenous farmers across generations of observation and deliberate selection. And here is the detail that reframes every assumption you carry about pre-contact agriculture. Those corn cobs were not wild. They were domesticated, meaning someone had already been selecting and cultivating this plant for generations before that cave was used. The calendar of indigenous agriculture in North America does not begin at European contact. It goes back much, much further. But the corn is only the first piece of evidence. To understand why this system qualifies as a mystery, you need to understand what each plant does, not as food, but as an organism. Start with corn. Corn is a nitrogen predator. Every growing season, corn pulls nitrogen from the soil at a rate that, left unchecked, will exhaust that soil within a few generations. European colonial farmers learned this the hard way. Plant corn in the same field repeatedly, and, eventually, the field fails. The standard colonial solution was to rotate crops, leave fields fallow, or import fertilizer. Indigenous farmers across the Northeast and Southwest had a different solution, and it was already built into the system before European contact. Beans, specifically common beans, Phaseolus vulgaris. Beans form a symbiotic relationship with bacteria called rhizobium, which attach to the bean plant's root nodules. Those bacteria pull nitrogen directly from the atmosphere and deposit it into the soil. Think of it as beans writing a check to corn every growing season automatically, without fail. The corn draws down the nitrogen account, the beans replenish it. This is verifiable plant science. It has been confirmed by the USDA Agricultural Research Service in studies of traditional intercropping. But here is the detail that makes investigators pause. This process, nitrogen fixation by root nodules, was not named by Western science until the 19th century. The Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Dene, and dozens of other nations had been applying this principle for millennia before it had a Latin name. They did not call it nitrogen fixation. They called it relationship. Now look at what the corn does for the beans in return. Corn stalks grow to 6 to 8 feet tall and provide a natural trellis for bean vines. The beans spiral upward without being directed, using the corn stalk as their scaffolding. No external structure required, no wooden stakes, no rope, no engineering beyond the biology of the plants themselves. This is structural engineering embedded in the organisms. The corn did not evolve to support beans. The beans did not evolve to climb corn. Someone selected and placed these two plants together until the relationship became reliable. That process required generations of observation. Generations, not seasons, generations. Now add the third plant. Squash Cucurbita pepo spreads wide and low along the ground between the corn and bean stalks. Its broad leaves create a living canopy over the soil. That canopy reduces soil moisture evaporation by approximately 20 to 25%, a figure documented in ethnobotany research. It also suppresses competing weeds by blocking sunlight from reaching the ground beneath. No herbicide, no irrigation infrastructure, no additional labor beyond planting. The squash leaf is doing the work of a technology that European agriculture would not develop for centuries. Stand in a Three Sisters field in midsummer. The air between the stalks is noticeably cooler. The soil beneath the squash leaves is dark and damp, when the ground 10 feet away is dry and cracked. You can feel the moisture management system operating in real time. 3 plants, 3 biological functions, perfectly interlocked. The corn is the infrastructure. The beans are the fertilizer factory. The squash is the moisture management system. Indigenous farmers built what Silicon Valley would call a closed-loop, self-sustaining ecosystem, and they did it 4,000 years before the term existed. But the mystery is not just that the system works. The mystery is that squash also repels insects. The rough, hair-like texture of squash leaves and stems, called trichomes, creates a physical barrier that deters aphids, beetles, and other pest species from crossing into the corn and bean stalks. This is not a happy accident. This is integrated pest management. No documentary about the Three Sisters has ever paused here long enough to ask, who noticed that? Who watched an insect stop at the edge of a squash leaf and then selected for that plant trait across generations? That observation required a scientist. It required documentation perhaps not written, but encoded in oral tradition, in planting practice, in the language itself. The Haudenosaunee word for the Three Sisters is Deohako, meaning the life supporters. That is not a casual name. That is a classification system. It encodes the knowledge that these 3 plants together sustain life in a way that no one of them does alone. By approximately 1100 AD, a city existed near present-day Collinsville, Illinois, that most Americans have never heard of. It was called Cahokia. At its peak, Cahokia held a population of more than 20,000 people, larger than London, at the same date. Cahokia was sustained in substantial part by Three Sisters agriculture on the floodplains of the Mississippi River. Archaeologists from the Illinois State Museum identified corn storage pits in excavations across the site. Those pits represent a food system scaled to feed a metropolis. The Three Sisters were not a village garden. They were an urban food supply chain. Timothy Pauketat, whose research on Cahokia is one of the primary academic records of this site, documents a civilization whose agricultural infrastructure made this density of human settlement possible. No European city of comparable size at that date had solved soil exhaustion without fallow rotation. Cahokia's fields kept producing because the beans kept replenishing the soil the corn consumed. The system was self-funding. Now consider the nutrition question, which adds another layer to this cold case. Corn alone is nutritionally incomplete. It is deficient in an amino acid called lysine, which the human body cannot synthesize on its own. Beans supply lysine, precisely what corn lacks. But beans are themselves deficient in methionine, and corn partially compensates. Together, corn and beans provide a near-complete essential amino acid profile. Indigenous farmers across the Northeast and Southwest achieved this nutritional balance thousands of years before the science of amino acids had a name. The Smithsonian Institution's food history records confirm this nutritional pairing as one of the most sophisticated dietary solutions in human history. 3 plants, structural support, nitrogen cycling, moisture retention, pest deterrence, complete protein. Every function interlocked, every deficit covered. This is not farming. This is applied biology operating across multiple scientific disciplines simultaneously. And it was developed, tested, refined, and transmitted by indigenous farmers without any input from any civilization in the Eastern Hemisphere. In 1748, Jesuit missionary Father Francesco Giuseppe Bressani documented Wendat women in what is now Ontario, Canada, cultivating corn, beans, and squash together. He was one of the earliest Europeans to describe the Three Sisters system in writing. His records confirm the system was already mature and standardized, not experimental, not transitional. By the time Europeans arrived to write it down, it had been running for more than 3,000 years. So the archaeological record establishes the system. The plant science confirms its biological logic. But the cold case is not solved. The corn, the beans, the squash, each species had its own wild ancestor, its own evolutionary history, its own habitat. None of them evolved in proximity to each other. None of them needed each other to survive independently. The question that remains open: how did human observers identify a multi-species relationship that Western science would not fully explain for another 3,000 years? The evidence points to a method of knowledge production that European scientific tradition did not recognize as valid until very recently. Observation, documentation in oral form, transmission across generations, iterative refinement over centuries. This was a research program. It simply did not look like one by European standards. Now, what happened when that research program collided with a different civilization's assumptions about who counts as a scientist? Gary Paul Nabhan, whose ethnobotany research is among the most respected in this field, describes the Three Sisters as a product of active human selection over millennia, not passive observation, not stumbling upon a lucky combination. Active selection, meaning indigenous farmers were deliberately choosing which plants to replant based on observed outcomes. That is the definition of applied science. The corn cobs in Bat Cave were small, finger-sized, because domestication was still in early stages 4,000 years ago. Over the following millennia, indigenous farmers selected for larger cobs, higher starch content, drought resistance, pest resistance. The corn you can buy at any American grocery store in 2024 is a product of that 4,000-year breeding program, not a USDA program, not a Monsanto program. An indigenous program, running continuously for 4,000 years. Now consider what the Haudenosaunee understood about these plants, that Western agriculture still has not fully integrated. In Haudenosaunee cosmology, in what the Onondaga Nation has shared publicly, the Three Sisters are not crops. They are Deohako, living relatives, beings who chose to sustain human life. This framing is not metaphor standing in for ignorance. It is a different way of knowing, one that encoded respect, reciprocity, and long-term stewardship into the relationship between farmers and their food. A civilization that calls its food supply living relatives does not exhaust its soil. A civilization that calls its corn infrastructure and its beans inputs eventually does. The Haudenosaunee Environmental Task Force has articulated this publicly in formal statements. The name Deohako reflects not sentiment but a cosmological understanding of interdependence. That understanding is what sustained the Three Sisters system across 4,000 years of continuous operation. In 1987, the Onondaga Nation formally articulated the sacred status of the Three Sisters in testimony related to land and sovereignty rights. They were not testifying about the past. They were asserting continuity into the present. The Three Sisters had never stopped being Deohako. The interruption had been external. Now, here is where the forensic record changes character. The interruption arrived with specific policy. In the 1860s, the United States federal government forced the Diné people, the Navajo Nation, on what history records as the Long Walk. Thousands of Diné people were marched hundreds of miles from their homeland to a federal reservation called Bosque Redondo. At Bosque Redondo, the federal government provided rations: commodity lard, white flour, salt. No corn, no beans, no squash. From those rations came fry bread, deep-fried dough made from what was given by the government. Fry bread is often presented today as traditional indigenous food. It is not. It is a document of forced removal. It is what people made when their food was taken. The Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian has documented this history explicitly. Diné scholar Lori Arviso Alvord and food historian Valerie Segrest have written on the cultural severance it represents. The removal of the Three Sisters from indigenous diets was not a side effect of colonization. It was, in documented cases, a mechanism of it. Federal ration systems replaced a 4,000-year food infrastructure with commodity goods that were nutritionally inferior and culturally severing. The amino acid profile that corn and beans together had provided the near-complete protein that sustained cities larger than London was replaced with white flour and lard. The health consequences are measurable and appear in reservation health records across the 20th century. Reservation communities that lost access to traditional Three Sisters food systems experienced epidemic rates of diabetes and diet-related disease in the 20th century. The USDA commodity food programs that replaced traditional agriculture contributed directly to this health crisis. This is a documented causal chain, not a grievance narrative. Food infrastructure was dismantled. A different, inferior food system was installed in its place. The population that had sustained 20,000-person cities on Three Sisters fields now received rations of commodity corn syrup and processed grain. The replacement was not nutritional improvement. It was the opposite. And what was lost alongside the food was harder to measure, but no less real. Sean Sherman, an Oglala Lakota chef who founded the Sioux Chef in Minneapolis, Minnesota in 2014, has been one of the most articulate voices on what that loss meant. Sherman has said, "Our food is our identity. When they took our food, they were taking our identity." 1. Read that again slowly. Not our food was part of our culture. Our food was our identity. The Three Sisters were not a side dish. They were a language, encoding knowledge, cosmology, health, relationship, and continuity. When forced ration systems replaced that food, they were performing a kind of erasure that did not require burning a single text. The boarding school system of the late 19th and early 20th centuries compounded this loss. Children were removed from communities where Three Sisters knowledge was transmitted through seasonal practice, through planting, tending, harvesting together. You cannot pass down a farming system in a classroom where the lesson plan was designed to break your connection to the land. The knowledge survived anyway. This is the part of the cold case that shifts from forensics to testimony. Dream of Wild Health, a nonprofit in Minnesota, has been one of the organizations working to reclaim and transmit Three Sisters seed knowledge to Indigenous communities. Crystal Wapapa, of the Kickapoo Nation, founded Wapapa's Kitchen in Oakland, California, a restaurant that operates explicitly as an act of food sovereignty, using Three Sisters ingredients to rebuild identity interrupted by federal policy. Brian Yazzie of the Navajo Nation works with Dream of Wild Health on the same premise. The knowledge is intact. What it needs is land, seeds, and the political space to operate. These are not revival projects. That word implies something was lost. These are continuity projects because the knowledge was never fully extinguished. It was held by elders, by seed savers, by communities who kept planting even when the land they were allowed to plant on was a fraction of what their ancestors had cultivated. The seeds from Bat Cave, the finger-sized corn cobs that Herbert Dick pulled from that New Mexico cave in 1948, represent one end of an unbroken line. The seeds in the ground at Dream of Wild Health represent the other end of that same line. 4,000 years, one continuous act of knowledge transmission. Now consider what it means that Western science is only now beginning to validate what that knowledge always contained. Soil microbiome research published in the 21st century confirms that the rhizobium bacteria in bean root nodules create lasting nitrogen deposits that persist in soil for multiple seasons. This means the Three Sisters system was not just fertilizing its own crop, it was building soil health across generational timescales. The Haudenosaunee farmers were investing in soil that their grandchildren's grandchildren would plant. That is a different relationship with time than annual crop planning. That is a different relationship with land than ownership. The squash trichome research the data on how those leaf hairs deter insect pests is still being published in ethnobotany journals. Entomologists are still mapping which specific pest species are deterred by which squash varieties. The full biological mechanism is still being described by Western science. The full biological mechanism was already being applied 4,000 years ago. This is the cold case's deepest implication. The evidence does not suggest that indigenous farmers got lucky with a good combination. The evidence suggests a 4,000-year research program observation, selection, transmission that produced results Western science is still catching up to. And that program was interrupted not by its own failure, but by external force. In 2021, Sean Sherman opened Owamni Restaurant in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Owamni sits on the banks of the Mississippi River, near the Falls of St. Anthony Land. The Dakota people have considered sacred for as long as their oral histories reach back. In 2022, Owamni won the James Beard Award for Best New Restaurant in the United States. The menu at Owamni centers Three Sisters ingredients: corn, beans, and squash, prepared through techniques and flavor profiles that predate Columbus by millennia. No wheat, no dairy, no ingredients introduced by colonization. The food on those plates is not a reconstruction of something lost. It is a continuation of something that never stopped. Sherman's argument made through every dish is the argument the evidence supports. Indigenous food knowledge was not primitive, not simple, not waiting for outside improvement. It was a sophisticated system that was suppressed, and that suppression had measurable health consequences that continue today. In 2024 and 2025, the Indigenous food sovereignty movement is using Three Sisters agriculture as a live political instrument. Organizations like the Indigenous Food Lab, affiliated with Sherman's work, and Dream of Wild Health are distributing Three Sisters seeds to reservation communities. These communities are experiencing epidemic rates of diabetes and metabolic disease directly linked to the displacement of traditional food systems by federal commodity programs. The beans that fix nitrogen in the soil are also fixing the lysine deficiency in a diet that lost its corn-bean pairing when rations replaced agriculture. The same biological relationship that sustained Cahokia is being deployed against the health crisis that commodity flour created. Crystal Wapapa runs her Oakland kitchen as a statement. This food never disappeared. The Three Sisters are not a historical artifact in any of these contexts. They are active infrastructure, nutritional, cultural, political. Now return to Bat Cave. Herbert Dick pulled those finger-sized corn cobs from the earth in 1948. He did not know he was documenting the beginning of a 40th-century research program. He thought he had found evidence of primitive agriculture. The evidence, properly read, shows something different. It shows the starting point of the most sophisticated intercropping system ever developed in the Western Hemisphere, refined continuously for 4,000 years by nations whose names the history textbooks rarely included. The Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Dene, the Wendat, dozens of nations across the northeast woodlands and the southwest, each nation contributing their own observations, their own seed selections, their own oral documentation to a system that no single civilization invented alone. This is the part the cold case cannot close. We do not know who first noticed that beans reinvigorated exhausted corn soil. We do not know who first observed that squash trichomes stopped insects at the field's edge. We do not know who first realized that corn deficient in lysine and beans deficient in methionine together fed a human body completely. Those names are not in any archive. They are in the seed. Every Three Sisters seed that was selected, saved, carried through forced removal, hidden from federal agents who burned indigenous gardens, and replanted on the other side, carries the compressed intelligence of those unnamed observers. The seed is the document. And unlike most documents from 4,000 years ago, it is still alive. The squash leaf is still deploying its trichomes. The bean nodule is still writing its nitrogen check to the corn. The corn stalk is still standing 8 feet tall, waiting for the bean vine that is already spiraling upward. The system did not need European contact to function. It did not need outside validation to be real. It needed what it always had: people who understood that food is not a commodity, but a relationship. Deohako, the life supporters. Not a poetic name, a scientific classification, one that encodes 4,000 years of empirical knowledge in 2 words. The cold case of the Three Sisters does not close with a solved mystery. It closes with a reframing. We asked, how did indigenous farmers know to combine 3 unrelated plants into a closed-loop biological system? The evidence says they did not know all at once. They learned it across generations, the way all genuine science works. Observation, selection, documentation, transmission, refinement. The difference is that their documentation system was oral, seasonal, and embodied, not written, not institutional. Western science did not recognize that as science until very recently. That failure of recognition had consequences. The seeds survived those consequences anyway. If you have never heard of Bat Cave, New Mexico before today, that is a data point about which stories get taught, not about which stories matter. The Haudenosaunee knew what was in those seeds. They named it Deohako and have not changed that name in 4,000 years. Sean Sherman knew it too. He plated it at Awamni and let a James Beard Award judge lift a fork on Dakota sacred land. Crystal Wapapa knows. Brian Yazzie knows. The seed savers at Dream of Wild Health know. The mystery was never where the three sisters came from. The mystery was always why it took this long for the rest of us to ask. The corn is still growing. The beans are still climbing. The squash is still holding the moisture in dark soil. 4,000 years old. Still running. Sources for everything in this video are in the description, including Herbert Dick's 1965 excavation record, Gary Paul Nabhan's ethnobotany research, and Sean Sherman's work with the Indigenous Food Lab. If you want to go deeper, the sources for everything are in the description below, including Herbert Dick's 1965 excavation record, Gary Paul Nabhan's ethnobotany research, and Sean Sherman's work with the Indigenous Food Lab. Drop in the comments, what was the fact that stopped you? Subscribe if you want the next cold case, because every chapter of Indigenous history that gets ignored is a mystery that is still open. The seeds were never lost. They were just waiting for someone to finally ask the right question.